My father sat at the head of the dining table, his chest puffed out with a terrifying kind of pride, the kind usually reserved for graduation ceremonies or wedding toasts, but tonight the atmosphere wasn't celebratory. It was heavy, thick with the scent of pot roast and a desperate, unspoken anxiety that had been plaguing the Williams household for years. I sat in my usual spot, the quiet corner, pushing green beans around my plate, listening to the rhythmic clinking of silverware that was the soundtrack to my childhood. My brothers, Jake and Marcus, were arguing animatedly about golf scores and client lunches, their loud voices bouncing off the walls of the room that had felt too small for my ambitions for as long as I could remember. Dad cleared his throat, a sound that instantly cut through the noise, silencing my brothers and bringing my mother's attentive gaze to his face. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life there wasn't just dismissal in his eyes, there was a triumph that made my blood run cold. He smiled, a tight, greedy smile, and said the words that would eventually dismantle our entire world. He told us that he had saved the family business, that Williams and Sons was going to survive, and that he had done it by taking the money from my trust fund. He had taken $230,000. He said he had finally put my money to good use. If you have ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed by the people who are supposed to love you the most, if you have ever sat silently while someone took credit for your hard work or mocked your passion, then hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn up your volume. Because today, I am going to tell you the story of how my family's arrogance, greed, and complete inability to listen to me led to their undoing. This is a story about what happens when you underestimate the quiet person in the room, and it is a story about the coldest kind of justice, the kind that comes not from revenge, but from the immutable, unyielding weight of the law. Get comfortable, because we are going to be here for a while, and by the end, you will understand why I made the choice that I did. To understand why that Sunday dinner ended the way it did, you have to understand the dynamic of the Williams family. For 31 years, I was the outlier, the oddball, the disappointment. Growing up as the youngest of 3 kids in a house that worshipped masculine bravado and business acumen, I learned very early that my opinion was about as valuable as a monopoly dollar. My older brothers, Jake and Marcus, were the golden children. They were loud, confident, and they followed the path my father laid out for them like religious disciples. They got business degrees, they joined the family construction firm, Williams and Sons, and they wore suits and hard hats like costumes of success. Dad paraded them around like trophies, constantly bragging about their deals and their potential to take over the empire he had built from the ground up. I was different. I was quiet. I liked books, I liked patterns, and I had a mind for numbers that terrified them because they couldn't understand it. While they were out shaking hands and slapping backs, I was buried in federal compliance manuals and financial forensics textbooks. The problem was they never cared to ask what I actually did. To them I was just Sarah, the government employee, the bureaucrat, the paper pusher. "What exactly do you do again, honey?" my mother would ask at every single family gathering, her eyes glazing over before I even opened my mouth. I would try to explain. I would use words like federal compliance, asset management, financial crimes, and enforcement network. But it was like speaking a dead language. My dad would just wave his hand dismissively, a gesture that had become a physical reflex of his disrespect for me. "Government bureaucracy," he would grumble into his mashed potatoes. "Wasting taxpayer dollars pushing paper around a desk. At least it's stable, I guess. A safe little job for a girl who didn't have the stomach for real business." It was infuriating, the absolute certainty with which they dismissed my life's work. They had no idea that while they were worrying about concrete deliveries and supplier invoices, I was a senior asset recovery specialist with the U.S. Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN. They didn't know that for the past 8 years, I had been hunting down the hidden wealth of international cartels, dismantling corporate fraud schemes that spanned continents, and tracking offshore banking conspiracies that moved hundreds of millions of dollars in the blink of an eye. They saw my modest Honda Civic and my practical apartment in the city, and assumed I was barely scraping by on a meager government salary. They didn't know about the federal security clearance that took 2 years to vet me for. They didn't know about the encrypted communications on my personal phone, or the fact that I regularly testified before grand juries about financial crimes that made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. To them, I was just the safety net, the one who didn't matter, the one who was always there to listen to their problems but never had any interesting problems of her own. The resentment really started to fester about 3 years ago when Dad's construction company hit the wall. For decades, Williams and Sons had been a decent mid-sized operation. It wasn't a Fortune 500 company, but it put food on the table and kept the brothers in new golf clubs. But then, a series of catastrophic contracts hit them all at once. Cost overruns bled the accounts dry, bad partnerships soured, and suddenly the company was hemorrhaging money. Dad refused to admit he was failing. It was never his fault. It was the economy, it was unfair competition, it was the government regulations that were strangling honest small businessmen. The dinner table conversations turned into therapy sessions for his ego, with him ranting for hours about red tape. If Sarah's government buddies would stop strangling us with regulations, maybe we could actually get some work done. He would shout, never catching the soul-crushing irony that his daughter was actually part of the very enforcement apparatus he hated. But the irony was lost on him, just as the reality of his son's contributions was lost on him. Jake and Marcus, rather than stepping up to save the ship, were busy rearranging deck chairs. Jake claimed to handle business development, which in reality meant he spent 3 afternoons a week playing golf with people who had no intention of hiring him, charging his greens fees and client lunches to the company credit card. Marcus managed operations, which apparently meant approving expensive launch parties for projects that were already behind schedule and refusing to visit actual job sites because he didn't like getting dust on his Italian shoes. They were leeches, sucking the life out of a dying beast, and yet in my father's eyes they could do no wrong. And me, I became the target. I was the convenient punching bag for their frustration. Because I wasn't part of the business, because I had a steady paycheck that they foolishly believed came from taxes, I was the enemy. "It's easy for you to judge us, Sarah," Marcus would sneer at me whenever I gently suggested that maybe they should downsize or cut overhead. "You sit in your cozy little office pushing paper. Try working in the real world where you actually have to produce results, where you have to fight for survival." I tried to stay quiet. I tried to be the supportive daughter. But they didn't know that I wasn't just observing their decline as a family member, I was observing it as a federal investigator. About 6 months before the dinner, Williams and Sons had popped up on my radar, not because I was looking for them, but because they were showing up in financial intelligence reports related to a massive money laundering investigation I was working on. I started seeing things that made my stomach churn. Shell companies with addresses that matched their business locations, influxes of cash that didn't align with the legitimate construction contracts they were winning, subcontractors with criminal histories a mile long were being paid vast sums for vague, consulting work. The writing was on the wall in neon letters. Williams and Sons was being used as a front to launder dirty money. Someone was feeding cash into the business to make it look profitable, using Dad's desperation against him. I had immediately recused myself from the direct investigation to avoid a conflict of interest, but I couldn't stop watching. I saw the disaster coming a mile away, a slow-motion train wreck that I was powerless to stop personally, but I knew the system would catch up to them eventually. The tension came to a head 6 months ago. During a weekend I spent helping my parents clean out their basement. Dad was helping me move some boxes of old files into my car when he accidentally knocked over a stack of my own paperwork. A bank statement fluttered to the floor of the garage. Before I could pick it up, he snatched it up. His eyes scanned the page, and then they bulged out of his head. He looked at the balance, then he looked at me, and the greed that washed over his face was so palpable it felt like a physical slap. $230,000, he gasped, his voice trembling. "Sarah, where did you get this kind of money? I thought you worked for the government." I tried to deflect. I tried to use the vague language I always used. "It's complicated, Dad. It's related to my work. It's held in a specific type of account." But he wasn't listening. He didn't hear the warning. He only heard the number. In his mind, that number wasn't a seized asset waiting for adjudication. It was a lifeline. It was the exact amount of cash injection he needed to pay off the creditors breathing down his neck and secure that new contract he was banking on. "This is perfect," he whispered, more to himself than to me. But by the time we got to the dinner table that night, the whisper had become a proclamation. "Sarah can invest in Williams and Sons," he announced to the family as if he had just closed a major deal. "It's a win-win. We save the business, she gets a stake in the family legacy." I felt the panic rising in my throat. "Dad, it's not that simple," I said, my voice tight. "That money is tied up in federal protocols. I can't just withdraw it and invest it in private businesses. It's not liquid like that." But he just waved his hand, that familiar, dismissive hand gesture that silenced me for 31 years. "There's always a way, Sarah. You just have to be willing to find it. You're too used to following rules that were made to be broken. And that was the start of the nightmare. The pressure campaign began in earnest. Mom called me every day, weeping about family loyalty, about how we stick together in tough times. Jake sent me articles about successful families who pooled their resources. Marcus accused me of hoarding my wealth while watching my father's life work crumble. "You're sitting on a fortune," he yelled at me during one phone call, "while your dad is having panic attacks in the middle of the night. What kind of daughter does that?" I tried so hard to explain. I sat them down, I looked them in the eye, and I told them the truth without breaking the non-disclosure agreements that bound me. I told them that the account wasn't a personal savings account. I told them it was held in trust for federal purposes. I told them there were legal restrictions that made it impossible to touch. But they didn't believe me. Or worse, they didn't care. To them, federal protocols was just another way of saying, "Sarah is being difficult." They truly believed that I was just making up excuses to avoid helping them, that I cared more about my bureaucratic red tape than my own flesh and blood. "Government excuses," Dad would mutter, staring at the TV. "There's always some regulation. You hire a lawyer, you file the paperwork, and you get your money. That's how the world works for people who aren't afraid of it." The situation escalated rapidly 3 weeks ago. Dad showed up to dinner on Sunday looking like a man who had just won the lottery, but with a shifty, nervous energy that set my teeth on edge. "I found a solution," he announced proudly. "I've been doing my research, I've been talking to lawyers." He went on to explain that he had found a legal team who specialized in unlocking trust funds. He spoke about hardship provisions and emergency business investment clauses. He said that for families in financial distress, there were ways to access money that was sitting idle. "I've found the loophole, Sarah," he said, beaming at me. "These guys know what they're doing. They've handled hundreds of cases like this. It's exactly what these provisions were designed for." I felt cold. "Dad, stop," I said, my voice low and serious. "This isn't a normal trust fund. It is managed by the federal government. I don't have the authority to withdraw from it, and even if I did, using it for a private business investment is a serious federal crime." He laughed. He actually laughed in my face. "You see," he said to my mom and brothers, "that's the government brainwashing talking. She's been programmed to think she can't touch her own money. It's psychological, Sarah. They've scared you into thinking you're powerless." "Dad, listen to me," I pleaded, leaning across the table. "Those lawyers you are talking to, if they are telling you they can access federal seizure accounts through a loophole, they are either lying to you or they are criminals. If you try to touch that money, you are going to prison." That was the moment he decided to stop listening to me entirely. In his eyes, I wasn't trying to protect him. I was the obstacle, I was the traitor. He made up his mind that he was going to save his family with or without my help, and if that meant going around me, then so be it. The breaking point came last Tuesday. It was our regular family dinner night. The atmosphere was strange, brittle. Dad was quiet, which was unlike him, and Mom kept shooting me nervous glances. When we finished dessert, Dad stood up. He cleared his throat and the room went silent. He looked at my brothers, then my mom, and finally he locked eyes with me. "I have some good news," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "I've solved our problems. Williams and Sons is going to survive. We're going to thrive." He paused for effect, savoring the moment. "I took your trust money for the company. It was transferred yesterday, $230,000, just like we needed." The silence that followed was absolute. For a second I couldn't breathe. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under the house. I stared at him, my mind racing, calculating the disaster. Then Mom started clapping. A slow, solitary clap that turned into applause. "Your father saved the business, Sarah. Isn't that wonderful?" she beamed. Jake slapped Dad on the back, grinning. "Brilliant move, Dad. I knew you'd figure it out." Marcus nodded approvingly. "The lawyers earned every penny." Sometimes you just need professionals who know how to work the system. I sat there, frozen, watching them celebrate a suicide pact. They had no idea. They had absolutely no idea they had just committed a litany of federal felonies that would destroy them. Unauthorized access to a federal asset seizure account, identity theft, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering. Dad wasn't looking at a payout, he was looking at 20 years to life. I forced myself to speak, my voice barely a whisper. How exactly did you access the account?" Dad waved his hand, dismissive as ever. "The lawyers handled the technical stuff, something about emergency trustee provisions. They had to use your social security number and some other personal info, but that's standard for trust transfers." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Where did you get my personal information?" Mom chimed in, helpful as ever. "Oh, we found those tax documents you left in the basement last month. We made copies for the lawyers. We thought we were helping." Federal tax document theft, accessing a secure government network using stolen credentials. The list of charges was growing by the second. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Dad," I said, my voice steadying as the adrenaline kicked in, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. That account was not a trust fund. It is a federal asset seizure account. It holds money that was seized from criminal organizations. It is evidence. By taking that money, you have not just stolen from a bank, you have stolen from the United States Treasury." The room went dead silent. Dad stared at me and then he burst out laughing. It was a nervous, brittle laugh. "Oh, Sarah," he chuckled, shaking his head. "The lawyers warned us about this. They said you'd try to scare us with stories about government restrictions to keep control of the money. It's a classic tactic, but the paperwork is done. The money is ours. You can stop the act." "I'm not acting," I said, the full weight of my authority finally bleeding into my tone. "That money was seized from drug traffickers. It is held by the Treasury Department until the cases are resolved. You have committed wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. You have to return it now." "That's enough," Jake shouted, standing up. "We get it, Sarah. You're jealous that Dad actually accomplished something. You're trying to scare us because you didn't want to contribute." But the lawyers confirmed it. "The money belongs to the beneficiary. That's you, and it's ours now." "I am not trying to scare you," I said, looking each of them in the eye. "I am telling you the reality of the situation. You need to contact those lawyers and reverse the transfer before the government realizes what happened." "Before the government realizes?" Marcus sneered. "What are they going to do, Sarah? Send the FBI after us for accessing our own daughter's account? Grow up." I looked at them, their arrogance, their ignorance, their absolute certainty that they were the smartest people in the room. I realized then that nothing I could say would save them. They had made their choice. They had chosen the fantasy over the reality. They had chosen the fake lawyers who promised easy money over the daughter who told them the hard truth. "Understood," I said softly. It was the word I used in interrogations when a suspect sealed their own fate. They thought I was agreeing with them. They thought I was submitting. They had no idea I was shifting modes. I was no longer their daughter. I was a federal agent who had just witnessed a confession to multiple felonies. I excused myself immediately. I walked out to my car, got in and locked the doors. My hands were shaking, not from fear but from the magnitude of what I had to do. I drove home in a daze, the streetlights blurring into streaks of color. When I walked into my apartment, I didn't take off my coat. I went straight to my secure line. The first call was to my supervisor at FinCEN. I reported that a federal asset seizure account under my oversight had been compromised. I reported the unauthorized transfer via identity theft and fraudulent protocols. The second call was to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. I gave them the names, the timeline, and the methods. I told them about the fake lawyers, the stolen tax documents, the confession at dinner. The third call was the hardest. It was to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I told them that Williams & Sons was likely the recipient of illicit funds. I told them that the business needed to be audited immediately to determine the scope of the money laundering operation I had suspected for months. By midnight, I had filed formal complaints. I had provided evidence of identity theft, wire fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering. I had documented everything my father had said, everything my brothers had done. I had effectively signed the arrest warrant for my own family. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch, staring at the wall, listening to the city wake up outside my window. I thought about the look on my dad's face when he told me he had saved the business. He thought he was a hero. He thought he was the patriarch providing for his flock. Instead, he was a common thief who had stolen from the very government he claimed to hate. The next morning, the hammer dropped. Dad was in his office at the construction site, probably admiring the bank balance on his computer screen when the calls started. First, it was his bank. They had flagged the transaction as suspicious and frozen the associated accounts. Then his lawyers, those professionals who knew how to work the system, called him. But their tone had changed. They weren't smooth talking anymore. They were panicked. They told him there were complications. They told him they were looking into it. Then the lines went dead. By the time the third call came, Dad was likely sweating through his dress shirt. It was Agent Jennifer Martinez from the IRS Criminal Division. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She told him that they had detected unauthorized access to federal assets. She told him that he was under investigation for money laundering and conspiracy. She told him not to leave town. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Dad. Sarah, he choked out, his voice small and terrified. There are some people here from the IRS. They think I did something wrong. They're saying the account isn't a trust fund. Yes, Dad, I said, my voice calm. I tried to explain that to you. But the lawyers said we could access it. They said it was legal. The lawyers lied to you, Dad. They took your money to help you commit a federal crime. That money wasn't mine. It was seized from drug cartels. It was evidence. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. I could hear his breathing, ragged and shallow. Sarah, he whispered, what's going to happen to me? You need to get a real lawyer, I said. A criminal defense attorney. You need to return the money. Can you help me? He pleaded. Can you explain to them? Can you tell them it was a mistake? I closed my eyes, feeling a tear slide down my cheek, but my heart was hard as stone. Dad, I can't help you. I'm the federal agent who reported the crime. The silence stretched out, agonizing and heavy. You're the one who called them, he finally asked, his voice cracking. You called the IRS on your own father. I had no choice, Dad. You stole money from the federal government. That's not a family dispute, that's a felony. He hung up on me. Over the next 3 days, the dominoes fell with the precision of a military operation. The IRS froze every single account Williams and Sons had. The FBI descended on the office with search warrants, seizing computers, files, and hard drives. The U.S. Attorney's Office began drafting indictments. And the lawyers, the smooth-talking professionals who had promised my dad a loophole, they vanished. Their office was empty. The phone numbers were disconnected. They were gone, likely with whatever consultation fee Dad had paid them, leaving him to face the music alone. But the worst part, the part that truly sealed the coffin, was when the forensic accountants started tracing the money that had been keeping the business afloat for the past year. The lucrative contracts Dad had been so proud of, the ones he thought proved his business genius, they were fake. They were payments from a drug trafficking organization. Williams and Sons wasn't just a failing construction company. It was a laundromat for narcotic dollars. Dad had been washing drug money for a cartel, and he hadn't even known it. He had been so desperate, so blinded by his ego, that he had accepted cash from criminals without asking a single question. Agent Martinez called me in for a briefing a few days later. She looked tired. Your father may have been an unwitting participant in the laundering, she said, her voice professional but sympathetic. He was used, but ignorance isn't a defense, Sarah. He took the money, he didn't report it, he benefited from it, he's going to have to answer for it. I nodded. I knew the law, I knew the penalty. The final family meeting was held on a Friday afternoon in the same living room where Dad had announced his brilliant plan just a week earlier. But this time there was no pot roast. There was no celebration. The air in the room was stale, smelled of old coffee and despair. Jake and Marcus were sitting on the couch, staring at the floor. Mom was in the kitchen, crying softly, the sound muffled by the closing of the sliding doors. Dad sat in his recliner, looking 20 years older. He was holding a stack of legal documents, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold them. Lawyers want $100,000 for a retainer, Dad said, his voice hollow, not looking up as I walked in. Real lawyers this time, criminal defense. The business accounts are frozen, Jake muttered, his voice devoid of its usual arrogance. We can't make payroll, we can't pay the suppliers, the guys on the site. They just walked off. 30 years, Marcus whispered, looking at me with pure hatred. 30 years we built this business, gone, because Sarah decided to destroy her own father. I walked over to the armchair opposite Dad and sat down. I kept my posture straight, my expression neutral. I was in work mode. I didn't destroy anything, Marcus, I said evenly. Dad committed federal crimes. I reported those crimes because that is my job. It is my legal obligation. Your job, Mom came out of the kitchen, her eyes red and swollen, her face twisted in anger. Your job is to protect your family, not to destroy them. How could you do this to us? My job is to investigate financial crimes and recover stolen assets, I replied, keeping my voice level despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. When Dad accessed that federal account, he became a criminal. My personal relationship with him does not grant him immunity from the law. You could have warned us, Jake shouted, jumping up. You could have explained it before he got in this deep. I tried to warn you, I said, my voice rising slightly. I sat right there at that table and told you it was a federal crime. I told you the account was protected. I told you the lawyers were lying. You didn't listen. You laughed at me. You told me I was brainwashed. You never explained it clearly, Marcus yelled. You talked about protocols and restrictions, but you never said it was criminal money. I told you repeatedly that the account was managed by the federal government and accessing it was a federal crime. I fired back. What part of federal crime was confusing to you? The part where you're a federal agent. Dad shouted, finally looking up at me. You never told us you were a cop, you hid it from us. I told you I worked in federal compliance and asset management, I countered. I can't give you classified details, but I can tell you when you're breaking the law, and I did. Compliance and asset management sounds like accounting, Mom screamed. It doesn't sound like you're going to arrest your father, because I can't discuss classified operations with my family. I stood up now, my frustration boiling over. But I can tell you when you're about to commit a felony, I tried. You chose to believe a bunch of con artists over your own daughter. The room fell silent save for Mom's sobbing. The weight of the reality was finally crushing them. So what happens now? Dad asked, his voice barely a whisper. Now you face prosecution, I said softly. The U.S. attorney is filing charges. Wire fraud, bank fraud, identity theft, money laundering. You're looking at decades in federal prison, Dad. What about the money? Jake asked, hope flickering in his eyes. Can we give it back? Can we make this go away? The money was returned yesterday, I said, but that doesn't erase the crime. You can't unrob a bank. This is insane, Marcus buried his face in his hands. Sarah works for them. She can fix this. Just tell them it was a mistake, Sarah. I can't fix federal crimes, Marcus, I said. I can only investigate them. You chose your job over your family, Mom hissed at me, her eyes full of venom. I chose the law over crime, I said simply. You just don't understand the difference. Just then the doorbell rang. It wasn't a friendly ring. It was a sharp, authoritative knock. Dad flinched. I knew who it was. I walked to the door and opened it. Agent Martinez stood there, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. She held a sheaf of papers in her hand. Mr. Williams, she said, walking into the living room, we have a warrant for your arrest. Dad stood up slowly. He looked at me one last time, a look of utter betrayal and confusion in his eyes. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? He asked me. Do you have any idea what you did when you decided to steal from the government? I replied, my voice breaking slightly. When you decided to launder drug money, you did this, Dad. I just gave you the warning you refused to hear. Agent Martinez stepped forward, pulled out a pair of handcuffs and began reading him his rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the cold steel clicked around his wrists, Mom let out a wail that sounded like a wounded animal. She turned on me, spitting words that would stay with me forever. I hope you're proud of yourself, she screamed. You've destroyed your family to protect drug money. You're a monster. I protected the law, Mom, I said, watching the marshals lead my father toward the door. Dad destroyed this family when he decided to be a criminal. Jake and Marcus wouldn't even look at me as they followed the police out to the driveway. They were in shock, their privileged worlds shattered in a single week. I stood alone in the living room for a long time after they left. I looked at the empty recliner, the stack of unpaid bills, the family photos on the wall that showed a happy, successful family that had never really existed. It was all a facade. Just like Dad's business success, it was all built on lies, debt, and now crime. The legal aftermath was a slow, agonizing grind. The plea negotiations took 2 weeks. Dad's defense attorney argued that he was a victim of a scam, that he was manipulated by the fake lawyers, that he had no knowledge of the drug money laundering. And there was some truth to that. He wasn't a kingpin. He was a desperate, arrogant fool. The U.S. attorney, knowing that I was the one who reported him and that I was a credible witness, offered a deal. To avoid a trial that would embarrass the government and put me on the stand against my own father, they offered a plea bargain. Dad pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit money laundering and wire fraud. In exchange, the other charges were dropped, but the sentence was still severe, 12 years in federal prison. When the judge read the sentence, Mom collapsed in the gallery. 12 years. Dad would be nearly 80 years old when he got out. Williams and Sons was seized under asset forfeiture laws. The equipment, the property, the bank accounts, it was all liquidated. Jake and Marcus, who had lived like princes on dirty money, were suddenly unemployed and unemployable, their reputations in tatters. They were facing their own separate investigations for their role in the scheme. Mom was forced to sell the house to pay for Dad's legal fees and the restitution he owed. The family empire was gone, dust. The final time I saw them was in the lobby of the federal courthouse after the sentencing. It was a grey, rainy day, fitting the mood. They were huddled together like refugees, looking at me with a mixture of hatred and desperation. 12 years, Mom whispered, her eyes dead. He'll be an old man, he might die in there. He should have listened to me, I said, clutching my purse. You did this, Marcus said, stepping toward me, his finger in my face. You ruined our lives. No, Marcus, I said, looking him dead in the eye. I did my job. You ruined your lives by living beyond your means, by stealing, and by thinking you were above the law. You made a choice. I just made sure you faced the consequences of it. You could have found another way, Mom wept. You could have helped us fix it. There was no other way, I said. You don't get to commit federal crimes and then ask for a family favor to make it go away. That's not how the world works. I turned to leave. Where will you go? Jake asked, his voice small. Back to work, I said over my shoulder. I have a job to do. You chose your job over us, Mom called out to my retreating back. I chose the truth, I said, and I walked out of the courthouse into the rain. 3 months later, I received a letter. It was from the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg. The handwriting was shaky, unfamiliar. I opened it in my apartment, surrounded by the quiet safety of my real life. Sarah, it read. I have a lot of time to think in here. The lawyers, the ones who scammed us. They got caught too. Agent Martinez told me I was so arrogant. I thought I was smarter than everyone. I thought I was smarter than you. I know now that you were trying to protect me. I should have listened. I should have trusted my daughter instead of my own ego. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the money, for the business, and for blaming you for my own crimes. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand. I put the letter down on my table. I didn't cry. I didn't feel a surge of triumph or a desire for revenge. I just felt a profound, aching sense of sadness. The Williams family was over. The illusion was shattered. But as I looked out my window at the city skyline, I knew I had done the right thing. Justice isn't always warm and fuzzy. Sometimes it's cold, hard, and painful. Sometimes it burns the people you love, but without it, we're just animals fighting over scraps. I am a federal agent. It is who I am. It is who I will always be. And if I had to go back to that Sunday dinner knowing everything I know now, I would make the same call, because the law doesn't care about your last name and neither does justice. And in the end, that is the only thing that truly protects us. If this story hit you as hard as it hit me, smash that like button to let me know you value justice, even when it's painful. Tell us in the comments below, was I right to turn my father in or did family loyalty come first? I want to hear your take. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the dark side of the law. Thanks for listening.